Hi, I'm Doug Besheroff from the University of Maryland, and I'm delighted to introduce this panel discussion about two very important ballot measures that the voters will have to decide this coming election day. I'm from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and this is a Brody Forum brought to you with the assistance and support of the Norman and Florence Brody Public Policy Fund. And I'm delighted that for this program we also have as our partner the League of Women Voters of the state of Maryland, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. First, the rules of the discussion. We deliberately said this was not a debate, but we hope that we will have a full conversation and that we will have energy, if not strong, divisive words. We have two important topics, and what we decided to do was divide the discussion in two parts. We'll have a panel on each of the ballot measures. We'll talk a little bit of summary about the ballot measure, and each person will speak for about 3 minutes describing the ballot issue, and then I'll ask a series of questions for about 30 minutes, give or take, and then we'll take questions from the audience. But first, and there is one rule, which is I will not be Candy Crowley, as in the last debate, which is to say, no matter how outrageous the misstatements, I will not correct them. So feel free to say whatever you want. I will not say it's not true, except that we are in the Village of Friendship Heights Community Center, and we're delighted to have their hospitality as well. And I think we have a logo as well. So delighted, and let's get the show on the road. To start, I'd like to introduce Nancy Sarang, who is the president of the Maryland League of Women Voters. Many of you know that the League has been part of our political process for many years. I didn't realize that the League was formed in 1920, which means it's almost 100 years old. It has now men and women, so I guess you could call it the League of Men and Women, the League of Women and Men Voters, but we will let that go. And its purpose is to encourage an informed and active participation in government. We are delighted to partner with the League, and I can tell you personally that Nancy's been terrific. Nancy's going to summarize the other ballot measures that are before the Maryland voters, and then we'll begin with the discussion. Nancy, welcome.
Just one little quick thing. The League of Women Voters was formed in 1920 by the same suffragists who worked to get the vote. We keep the word women in there to honor that past, but we do welcome men in the League of Women Voters as well. So we are going to be talking about ballot questions 6 and 7, but first of all, I thought I would describe real briefly the other 5 statewide measures that you will all be voting on November 6th. Question 1 and question 2 are identical, except that question 1 pertains to Prince George's County and question 2 pertains to Baltimore County. These are both constitutional amendments, and what they would do, if passed, is change the qualifications to serve as an orphans court judge. Currently, only orphans court judges in the city of Baltimore are required to be practicing lawyers and members of the bar. If this constitutional amendment passes and a majority of voters statewide, as well as the majority of voters in those 2 jurisdictions, vote affirmatively, then that would be a requirement for judges in that jurisdiction. Since we're in Montgomery County, many of you may not be familiar with orphans court judges because we don't have an orphans court in Montgomery County. It was abolished some time ago, and now the district court serves the function. What orphans courts do is they manage primarily things related to estates of deceased people. So that's question 1 and 2. Question number 3 is also a constitutional amendment, and what question 3 would do is expedite the removal of an elected official from office if that elected official is either found guilty of a felony or a certain misdemeanor that interferes with his public duty, or if that elected official pleads guilty or no contest to such a charge. If this constitutional amendment becomes law, it would apply to elected officials at the city, county, and state level. So that's question 1, 2, and 3. Question 4 is not a constitutional amendment. What question 4 is a referendum that made it to the ballot by way of a petition. In the state of Maryland, the Constitution says if the voters don't like a piece of legislation that was passed by the General Assembly, if they get sufficient numbers of signatures on a petition, then the voters of the state will have the opportunity to decide whether or not they agree or disagree with that law. It takes a number of registered voters that equals at least 3% of the number of voters that voted in the last gubernatorial election to get enough signatures to get it on a petition. So question 4 is about the higher education tuition rates for certain undocumented residents and certain military personnel. So what this would do would make it possible for people who meet certain requirements to pay in-state instead of out-state tuition in Maryland schools. And it's a long list of requirements that they have to fulfill in order to qualify for this in-state tuition rate. That's question 4. Question 5 was also petitioned to the ballot by getting sufficient signatures among voters who wanted a chance to vote on it. And question 5 has to do with our congressional redistricting plan that was adopted by the General Assembly in a special session in 2011. As you probably know, every 10 years we have a census, and then the congressional districts are redrawn to reflect changes in the population. However, there were sufficient voters who weren't happy with the way those districts were drawn that they signed a petition and said they wanted a chance to vote on whether they approve or disapprove of that map. What would happen if the ballot measure passes, if enough people approve of it, then we will continue with the districts as adopted by the General Assembly during the special session. If the redistricting plan fails, what will happen is a new plan will have to be submitted during the next session of the General Assembly. Now, there is no requirement that that new plan be significantly different or come about in any different process, but there would have to be another map submitted to the voters. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We're going to talk about 6 and 7, but that's just a real quick overview, so I encourage all of you to get a League of Women Voters Voters Guide, and you'll have more information about these ballot measures. You'll have information about the background, some pros and cons, as well as the responses to questions that we asked of all the candidates that will be on your ballot. You can get a print voter's guide right out here in the lobby. They're also available at libraries and senior centers. If you don't want to use print, save a tree. It's also available online at vote411.org, and I encourage everyone to look up that resource because it will really help you know what's going on November 6th.
Let's turn to our first panel, and let me introduce Delegates Ann Kaiser and Heather Mizeur to come to the stage. Welcome, welcome. The topic is the gaming expansion referendum, and let me explain something. I get confused about this all the time. In many states, and when we read about these things in the newspapers, we think of these referenda or ballot measures as a way to strike down legislation, but in fact this is a vote of approval on this, so that if you are in favor of the expansion, you vote yes on the ballot measure. If you are against the expansion, you vote no. Have I got that right so far? Excellent. Before we begin, let me introduce our two speakers. Delegate Kaiser will take the pro position, and I told both delegates before we began I would make the following slight crack, which is that we have two Democrats on the panel because indeed the political establishment in our state has been divided on this issue, as is the general public. And as moderator for this program, I tried to learn as much as I could about the topic, and I'm still a little unclear about the issue, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. But first I want to say a little bit about each member of the panel. Delegate Kaiser has been a member of the Education Subcommittee of the Legislature since 2004 and chair since 2007. I hope I have that right. 8, my goodness. She's part of the Maryland Council of Educator Effectiveness. She graduated from the University of Michigan, and she's had stints in the Congressional Budget Office and the U.S. Treasury Department. And she was named Legislator of the Year by the Maryland Nurses Association in 2007. Delegate Mizeur has been on the by the way, they're both from Montgomery County, our home county, Appropriations Committee since 2009, and Joint Committee on Transparency and Open Government. I love it. And she was State Director of Maryland for Kerry Edwards in 2004. I've done enough talking. Let's get to the topic. Here are the rules. We're going to be a little loose about it, but we've asked them not to speak for more than 3 minutes at a time. And the way we're going to police it is that Travis Maltz over there has a piece of paper that says 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and stop. And at around stop, I start going, Anyway, Delegate Kaiser, would you open?
Sure. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I want to thank Nancy Sarang and the League of Women Voters, as well as the School of Public Policy, for organizing this today. And I'm glad, obviously, Nancy would mention their League of Women Voters Guide, but when I speak to groups about any of these ballot issues, I always mention it because it really is a good description, pro and con, of all the issues, so I do recommend that. And obviously, I think people, just by being here today, you clearly care about all the issues. I usually like to stress the importance of voting, and while and if you end up not being able to vote on election day, absentee ballots can still be received, as well as emergency absentee ballots at the last minute. So I'd like to mention that. One thing I've learned on the gambling issue is that people are seemingly all over the map. When you talk about other legislative initiatives and other priorities, you can kind of guess where people stand, and I find people on the far right and the far left want gambling, or they don't want gambling, or the other way around. So I think it's not an easy issue. There's a lot of pieces to it, but not really easy ways to break this down. And while certainly Delegate Mizeur and I disagree on this issue, I think we would both agree that on November 7th, it's the next question we care far more about, and certainly hope that marriage equality passes. So we can agree on that issue, disagree on this one, and be here today. Just to explain what the gambling legislation does, the first thing, this is not about allowing gambling in the state of Maryland, it's about expanding gambling. We already did this 4 years ago with slot machines that we have in the state, and so this is about allowing table games, it's about allowing a 6th location in Prince George's County, and it's about expanding the overall number of slot machines in the state. So if you're against gambling, well, then you already know how you're going to vote on this issue. But if you're against it altogether, know that we already have it. We're talking about expanding gambling and making it more competitive. We feel that the model that we currently have is not competitive with other states. I voted in favor of this in the legislature and supported it for several reasons, one of which is that I thought not only do the voters have the right to decide this at the ballot box, we essentially 4 years ago made it that way, that any time we expand gambling in the future, we must always go back to the voters, which is just, in a sense, another checks and balances on this kind of issue, which people care so much about. Again, I think it makes us more competitive with other states by adding in the table games and the 6th location, which would be in Prince George's County. I think a lot of people like to play table games and don't necessarily want to drive the 2 hours to West Virginia or somewhere else. And lastly, I think it allows us to capture out-of-state dollars and increase jobs here in the state of Maryland. So those are my reasons, and I look forward to answering yours and other questions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Delegate Mizeur?
Thank you, Dr. Besheroff and Nancy Soring. I want to take you with me to every forum to explain the ballot issues. That was a great overview. And thanks to you and all the league, and to Norman and Florence Brody for your engagement in bringing forward the civic participation. We really appreciate it. Delegate Kaiser and I actually play in a poker group together in Annapolis. And I enjoy running the odds on a blackjack table when I have a chance. I go to Atlantic City and Las Vegas to do that. And every time I go, I think, great place to visit, wouldn't want to live there. And that is where I come down on gaming. What happens in Vegas should stay in Vegas. I'm not opposed to gaming. I understand its entertainment value. I don't think it should be the approach to solving our economic problems for this state. Maryland is the #1 state in the nation on research and development. We're very proud here in Montgomery County of the role we play in the knowledge-based innovation economy, and there are many ways that, and I'm looking forward in the conversation to talking about other ways of creating jobs in this state where we don't have to look at gaming to be the answer for it. Gaming brings more crime, addiction, and poverty to our communities. There are untold costs associated with bringing expanded gaming here. And you're being barraged on your televisions right now by corporate interests that don't have Maryland's interest at heart. Two sides of the gaming interest, the guys who are already here with slot machines that don't want the sixth casino to come in, the guys that want to build the sixth casino, the neighboring states not wanting the competition. I'm really appreciating the opportunity to have a conversation today about Maryland's interest. If you look at all of the neighboring states who are already doing this, there's not one key economic indicator where they are better than Maryland. Their unemployment rates aren't better. Their schools certainly aren't better. They haven't done a better job of covering people with health care. Their environment isn't cleaner. They want to be like Maryland. Why are we lowering the bar to say that we want to somehow be competitive with them? Maryland already does it the right way, and we need this to not be a distraction towards the real work at hand of growing our diverse economy and creating jobs that lift our communities up rather than tear them down.
Thank you very much. I started trying to learn about this, and it seemed to me the way to start is to describe what happened when the state first approved gambling, what that was. And perhaps I could ask Delegate Kaiser to summarize what the state did, and I think it was 2008, and that would then get us to what this expansion is about. So could you describe what happened when the state first authorized gambling?
We authorized gambling in 2008, and it was brought to referendum that year. And at that time, we were talking just about slot machines. Many of us at the time thought table games should have come at the same time as slot machines. This discussion of who comes to play and who's willing to travel and who stays overnight and has the expensive dinner and does everything else, that if you're talking about economic development, why not have the table games? At the time, there was discussion of where should the slot parlors go. And there was a thought, let's put them at the established horse racing locations. And there was a lot of discussion that those aren't necessarily the right places. There was a thought that if we really want to make it easy for people to drive there, easy for dollars to be captured by people driving up and down 95, we should pick other locations. We picked several. There was a license fee that had to be paid. There was zoning issues in some of those respective counties. What's true is that we're only up and running in 3 of those places, but we're getting close at the Baltimore location. I'm sure that will lead to a question, if not now, because I don't want to take too long at this moment, about why expand now since the first installation isn't quite done. And I'm glad to answer that question when it comes up.
I think it's just been asked.
Okay. I think you look at it from a few ways. It's true. We set up this model 4 years ago, and we're not entirely done with what we thought we would do then. But I think it's also true that as we look to other states, as we allowed gambling, they've expanded some of their offerings of table games and other things. And a lot of people believe that, okay, we're not quite done, but why should that stop us from doing it the right way? Let's expand the right way. People may still go to the slot parlors. My parents have some friends who do to Arundel Mills, but a lot of people want to play table games, so they're still driving out of state. So this idea of the competition and about keeping people closer, keeping people not having to travel so far to play. And then there's also an idea, and this is more the political nuance. Anytime we pass gambling legislation, it has to go to the voters. I think the reality is a lot of our colleagues aren't as comfortable doing that in the other 2-year cycle when everyone is on the ballot, because no one knows how gambling really plays in their district, in their party, and so forth. So people would be a little more nervous. Delegate Mizeur and I might still comfortably vote yes and no at that time, but others might change. So there's a sense that this won't happen but 4 years later, and why do we want to wait 4 more years? And I'm sorry if I've lost people, and it's just the political timing of when our ballot questions come up, that there's a sense that we'd have to wait 4 more years and we'd lose many opportunities to build the right places and make the money we could be making between now and then.
Well, Delegate Mizeur, it's the right places, but if I read the news clippings right, one of the likely places is National Harbor, and it's likely to be a destination resort, and at least the Washington Post said $800 or $900 million facility. I mean, this is a big facility. I'm looking forward to visiting it for all the obvious reasons. And yet we don't seem to have a good handle on the finances of these programs for the state. Is that right? Do we know how much will come in, how much the benefits, how much these casinos will benefit the taxpayers?
Well, I think it's helpful to rewind as you started the initial question about what was promised coming out of 2007. Consistently, when the issue of gaming comes up. It is a trail of broken promises. We were supposed to get $660 million towards education funding that was promised to the state, millions of dollars in opportunities for minority business enterprises, and we've seen less than 15% of that return. And if we were seeing what was promised from slots to begin with, we probably wouldn't even be having the conversation about doing an expansion. And when that money comes into the Education Trust Fund, it's the state operates our education funding on a formula that is already mandated under law called the Thornton formula. It's the Bridge to Excellence program. And money that's coming in for education from slots, whether it meets the goal or not, is just money that then supplants the money that was already in the budget for education. It frees up that money for other spending. Now, whether or not that's okay, there's a whole separate discussion, but whether or not this is actually new money for education, I think, is a question that has been posed. That, you know, there tends to be more unanswered questions than answered questions on this, but looking to the experience of what we've had so far on slots, there were a lot of promises made and a lot of promises that didn't exactly come through.
Well, I think this question of whether the money is for education or not is an important one. The money is supposed to go into the Education Trust, but as I understand it, the level of education funding is determined by the Thornton Act and other state legislation. And so the money that comes in actually is for the benefit of the general treasury, which is all right. We want the general treasury to benefit as well. Delegate Kaiser, is that accurate, that this is not actually money that will automatically increase education spending?
Well, yes and no, and I apologize for giving that answer at first. I've been in the legislature for 10 years. I've been chairing the Education Subcommittee for 5 years. I'm so proud that we in Maryland always place education as our #1 priority. The entire time we've both been in the legislature, it's been tough economic times, and we've had to make tough choices in every area, and yet during that time we've been able to maintain our education funding, in some ways expand it, and then this past year on a bill I worked on, maintenance of effort, to ensure that the counties continue to work on their obligation. For the past 4 years, Maryland has been ranked #1 in education across the nation. You might hear a presidential candidate saying another state has been rated that way, but Education Week magazine has said we've been #1 4 straight years. So I think it's proven that we're always going to meet our education priorities, but it's also true that from the environment and other issues that we haven't been able to fully meet in these last few years. So there's this money that's coming in from gambling, in a sense, ensures through our Education Trust Fund that we have this extra money for education. It's true this funding, our education funding is made through formulas that we have, but I would also say that during tough economic times, we haven't had to cut into education, but we unfortunately have had to cut in some other areas. So I also look at this money as both a backstop to support education and a way to help us fund some of our environmental and other progressive priorities.
Well, you mentioned the tough education times, Delegate Kaiser, and these are tough on many ways, high unemployment. And so one of the reasons that is given for the expansion is jobs. And yet the experience in many places has been that the promise of jobs has been ephemeral. Can you talk a little bit about your sense of what will happen with additional jobs here in the state if this ballot measure is approved?
I think there's a lot of different numbers out there, and I'm not sure whether I believe the high estimates that are out there. You know, Delegate Mizeur already talked about all the commercials and arguing these issues on all sides. I mean, I think it's certainly true that in the short term there are these construction jobs, and I think those are real jobs, those are good jobs, union jobs in most cases, and so I think that is good for the state of Maryland. Those are the short-term jobs, certainly in building these facilities. In terms of the permanent jobs, I've heard a lot of people say, well, that $50,000 a year job at the casino where someone's dealing blackjack for $25,000 a year and getting apparently another $25,000 in tips, that's not a good job. And while that might be a job that a lot of people in Montgomery County might say, well, that's not really a good job, there's a lot of unemployed and underemployed people in this state, and that would be a fantastic job. And the fact that that doesn't lead to job training and future other jobs while that's true, I think, again, the people out there who are hurting right now and looking for a job, they look that this would be a great job. I mean, I think one of the things you'll hear is that it displaces other jobs. They're certainly true. When it's Saturday night, and tonight my partner and I can decide where do we want to go with our friend in town and spend our entertainment dollars. And there's a sense that people go out to dinner and a movie. They might go a quick dinner and up to a Rundle Mills or somewhere else to play the slots. So there's a sense that if we choose the slots over the movie theater, over the dinner, that we're displacing those dollars. And I certainly think that's a valid point that some would make. And so some would say that other jobs get lost. But I think in the long term that there will be these extra jobs, probably not as many as people are saying through these estimates. And I do think it will bring in real money. I think another point that Delegate Mizeur is making, that we're working on this rather than working on real job creation or real workforce development. And I agree, we should be doing more on job creation and workforce development. The legislature should be seeing these as their top priorities. But to remind you, on November 6th, the ballot question is not should we do expanded gambling or job creation. And the question is not should we do expanded gambling or more workforce development. The question is should we expand gambling or not. So to me, that's the ultimate question. All these other things should be priorities of the legislature, and I'm sure we would both agree that the governor should call a special session on job creation. But right now we're talking about gambling, and I do believe it will bring in these jobs in the long term.
Delegate Mizeur, more jobs?
Thank you. This crisis of having a special session to do look at gaming was manufactured politically. We could have just as easily had a special session to address our transportation trust fund crisis, a real crisis. We could build the Purple Line connecting Montgomery and Prince George's counties and create 27,000 good construction jobs. The Red Line up in Baltimore City would bring another 15,000 jobs, dwarfing the suggestion that we are creating the jobs we need to create through gaming just on transportation alone if we were to address that funding crisis. And you know what? We're dangerously close to threatening our federal match for both of those projects because our state investment and our ability to fund those projects from our state obligation is so at risk. That's the real crisis we should have been addressing. Instead, we were called in to have the discussion about gaming. And I'm suggesting to you that a rejection of this when you vote no on question 7 is to send a signal to the leadership throughout this state that you expect more, that we're not going to take the lazy approach and the easy fix and to say, well, let's just go with gaming because that's easy and that's there. No, we expect more. We're going to hold our leadership to higher standards. We want jobs, but we want jobs that will improve our community, connect us, get our goods and services moving, create good, long-standing jobs. We can be putting construction workers to work rebuilding our schools and 21st century learning centers for our kids, not casinos.
I'm uncomfortable asking the following question, so I'm going to ask it and either one of you can answer it. From what I've read, many voters in the state are uncomfortable about the choice. They feel as if this has got nothing to do with the public good, but that this is a version of either crony capitalism or some kind of, and I don't mean this in terms of paid corruption, but that the state's not focusing on the most important things before it. One of you mentioned all the ads. I received 3 in the last 2 days. Great deal of money is being spent on this. I read in the paper that it's $40 million, and the Post said that was more money than was spent on the last gubernatorial election.
Yes.
So clearly there are large economic interests involved here. And I think the voters look at this, and I think it feeds, that since the storyline doesn't seem to be clear, it seems to breed a certain cynicism about what this is all about. And as I said, I wasn't going to attend. Either one of you and both of you can answer this question. It is a troubling one, I think, for many people.
I think that when you look at how this bill was structured, you have a lot of tax breaks going to casino operators, so people should be cynical. We spent the first special session this summer raising tax on Marylanders and the second special session lowering taxes on casino operators. We have in Maryland a tax that everyone who runs a small business gets really frustrated with. It's a personal property tax. When you own a business, you buy a computer, a fax machine, a copy machine, you pay your sales tax on that. But then every year you have to file with the state, pay a fee, and show the depreciated value of those assets and pay a tax on those assets. And if you're a company that has a lot of machinery, that is a huge burden on you. Guess who doesn't have to pay the personal property taxes in Maryland? The casinos. All those machines, all those slot machines, they're exempted. Now, I want to exempt small businesses from that tax by closing corporate tax loopholes. We have combined reporting that exists on the books. If we were to close a loophole that exists right now that allows some gigantic corporations like Comcast and Pepco of all corporations to pay not a penny of Maryland state taxes because they are headquartered in a neighboring state, if we close that loophole, we can close down that tax break, that tax that is harming small businesses. And that would be a job creator. You put money in the hands of small businesses, they invest in their workforce, and the money comes back into the economy. But there is a lot of cynicism about the gaming because while we're struggling to figure out how to give the average small business owner in Maryland a tax benefit for their jobs and their employees, we baked it right into the casino bill. It's another reason why I think you should reject it and vote no on question 7.
Delegate Kaiser?
I agree. I do think there's a lot of cynicism on the issue. I think there have been a lot of commercials on the issue, and I think a lot of the commercials have been confusing people. I know because people have reached out to me and said, oh my God, what should I do about this gambling issue? And what about all these things I'm hearing in the commercials? And I try to say, strip all of that away. It just really comes back to the very simple question of expanding gambling. Do you want the table games here in Maryland or not? And all these other things are the part of the storyline and the narratives of these large corporations and why they want one thing or the other, but I think it comes down to what we in Maryland want. A majority of Marylanders, obviously, because we have it now, voted in favor of slot machines 4 years ago. That was true in every jurisdiction, though Montgomery County was the lowest of the 24 jurisdictions. But I think I think the cynicism is being driven by these commercials, but I think when you strip down the issue, when you look about do you want to expand gambling or not, when you read again the League of Women Voters Guide and look at the pros and cons of all of these things, I think it then becomes a far simpler issue. Again, in regards to what Delegate Mizeur said on terms of transportation and school construction and everything else, again, this question that we have on November 6th is not an either or. Right now it's gambling or not gambling. All these things that we need to do in transportation, school construction, and these are areas that I've worked in, these are areas that she's worked on. We do need to do these as a state, but again, remembering to say that we shouldn't do this, we should be doing something else is not the question that's facing us on the ballot November 6th. Should we expand gambling or not? I believe we should.
Well, so Delegate Mizeur, so Delegate Kaiser said, in effect, you can't be half pregnant. We have gambling, and we have these interests, and for better or worse, there's a lot of money sloshing around. We just should swallow hard and assume that that's the world that we live in. Approve the gambling and get as many tax revenues as we can. And then move on and use some of that money for job training or whatever. What's wrong with that?
This doesn't have to be the world that we live in. It's the world that we live in if we just sit back and allow it to happen. The slot machines, I oppose the slot machines as well. I voted against that in 2007 as well for the similar reasons and not wanting that to be the approach for our economy. But there's this dangerous slippery slope that happens, and we predicted it in 2007. We said you get slots, then the next thing they'll be asking for table games, and the next thing you know, all of a sudden Maryland becomes undistinguishable to New Jersey's Atlantic City and Las Vegas and the other communities that are doing this. And that's just not the vision for Maryland that I have. We have the Chesapeake Bay, the nation's treasure of the Bay, and jobs that come along with focusing on keeping our Bay clean and getting our watermen back to work by restoring the health of the Bay. We can put the same union construction workers to work who are looking at the opportunity for jobs through casinos by rebuilding our schools. We have a $15 billion backlog in school construction in this state. And some of us have been working on a plan to advance a public-private partnership where you bring educators, government, nonprofits, business, and labor unions together for a plan to leverage the resources necessary to be able to do a large-scale renovation of schools in our struggling communities. And when we do that, when we engage with the labor unions and have them invest their pension funds in this project, they get, in exchange, jobs that will be union jobs and union wages. Who wouldn't rather be working on building a school and creating an environment for our next generation of educators, nurses, doctors, community activists in the future for our kids, rather than the casinos that we have seen bring crime, addiction, and poverty to their communities. I think that it's just a question of what kind of a Maryland do we want, and on the notion that you can have both, I'm just going to suggest that I think there's a sense among leadership that if gaming gets approved, then we've checked the economy box, we've checked the job creation box, and we kind of move on. We have to put pressure and use this as an opportunity to demand more of our leadership, that there be real jobs plans out there that will grow Maryland in the direction that we all have a vision for Maryland to be. We're not going to be Vegas and Atlantic City if you have something to say about it in rejecting question 7.
I'd like to ask a two-part question before turning to the audience for questions. And we'll have a microphone set up for that in just a moment. Let me ask you both to answer the following question, but separately. If the ballot measure passes and the expansion's approved, what's the best case result? What's the worst case result? And then I'm going to ask you separately, then I'm going to say, if the ballot measure is disapproved so that the expansion is not approved by the voters, what will happen and what's the best case result and the worst case? So what I'm asking you to do is to help us understand what's at stake. This has been a very enlightening conversation, but I'm still trying to figure out, well, what will happen 6 months or 3 years from now? I'll start with Delegate Kaiser for the if it passes, and then I'll switch for if it fails.
And I should give the best and worst case scenario under passage. Okay,
Under
because
passage.
I think I could answer the disapproval question too. Probably both could switch this.
I'll ask you both. No, I'll ask you both to respond.
Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of the expansion, I think I've already touched on a lot of the points of why expanding gambling and how that could help us in terms of the short-term jobs in construction as well as the long-term jobs at the casinos. I think what also pointing out, again, I agree with Delegate Mizeur about all the things that labor and others could be doing with school construction and building roads, but our labor unions are also almost universally in support of this gambling measure because they want these jobs now, and I think they hope and they expect us. I'm not sure there's really any reason to suspect this sense of a job creation box being checked off. We have a lot more to do in front of us in Annapolis in terms of job creation, transportation, education, and so forth. So I think with expansion that we, again, we expand to table games. They're put in almost immediately in the current slot facilities. The other facilities come online relatively soon, though the Prince George's one, it's kind of built-in delay of about 2.5 years. And that we do see these jobs come in. And I think, and continuing on the best case scenario, and I think it really happens whether we pass or don't pass the gambling issue, that of course that we come together and work on all these other priorities we have in transportation and education, the environment and everything else. But I really think that happens under both scenarios. In terms of the worst case result, I mean, I think Delegate Mizeur said that. Many others have described the reasons why you don't want gambling in the state. I think those points are well made by a lot of people, but so I don't think we're not going to become the next Vegas or the next Atlantic City. Atlantic City has what, like 10 casinos down the block from each other. We'll have 6 facilities 50 miles apart from each other. I think that's very different. So again, I think it's about capturing out-of-state dollars. And when we use that term, we talk about, you know, Marylanders might choose between location A, location B, and it doesn't really matter which place they go. But this facility that's likely to be at National Harbor in Prince George's County is right next to Washington, D.C., and right next to Virginia. And it's true. People do not come to the nation's capital for gambling, but they're going to find out that it's really nearby and creates that opportunity. So I do believe there's an opportunity for us to do what we call capture out-of-state dollars and not just having Marylanders funding, providing money that helps our general fund and helps with education.
So it's going to be the other shoe on the other foot in a moment, but the best case scenario, this passes. Delegate Mizeur. The best case. Give us the best and the worst case.
The best case of this passing. I was thinking about that actually.
Now, you know the rule among for politicians and everyone else is you don't have to answer the question asked. But you should know that I asked the question, but you really, if you
No, I mean, I think it's important to have those thoughts, and I've wrestled with that myself on morning walks, thinking through, you know, what happens if this passes. For me, the best case scenario I could come up with recently is probably far-fetched, but, you know, I think a best case scenario is far-fetched. I was thinking the other day about, well, okay, if this passes, is there a way to make a case for putting together a nonprofit casino where we would allow for an entertainment opportunity? We said gaming can exist. Well, let's have a nonprofit casino where instead of the money going into corporate pockets, we take the money and invest it instead in a range of social service projects and needs that the state budget has to fund, and then potentially you can actually lower people's tax rates as a new revenue source coming in. Because right now, the way it's set up, I mean, we always know how this is set up, right? The House always wins. I mean, that's the way this legislation was set up, too. Maryland's not going to win on this. It's the big Vegas casinos that are beating down the door and spending $40 million trying to come in this state. They're going to win the way this is set up if they're the ones that get to build the casinos. The best case scenario I can think of is if they weren't the ones that could operate the casino, and we came up with a whole brand new model of what a casino is, where we allow the voters to have, if they have their say and they say they want this expanded gaming, okay, fine, here it is. But let's come up with a new model where it's not sucking the dollars out into corporate interests. Instead, it could be potentially put into a range of nonprofit social service needs. But I think that's probably really far-fetched. But in a world where I'm walking along Sligo Creek Park trying to think about if I had a magic wand and could make this better, if it doesn't go my way, what would my magic wand do? And I said, I would come up with a nonprofit casino.
Now, it doesn't, now let's do it the other way before we turn to the audience for questions. It doesn't pass. What happens next?
Well, I think when it doesn't pass, it comes back to putting pressure on our leadership to do the right thing. If you look at Hagerstown, Maryland, and in Washington County, there is a Volvo powertrain plant that 1,100 manufacturers work at. And they are seeking economic development assistance from the state to try to do some upgrades to their plant to bring around maybe 300 to 500 new jobs. And we're not jumping at the chance to partner and figure out how to do that. Even though the Unilever ice cream plant in that area recently shut down, and some people who had manufacturing jobs for 25, 30 years of their lives are looking at being unemployed. We've lost 40,000 manufacturing jobs in this state in the last decade. We can have a Maryland turnaround in manufacturing if we make it a priority. And so whether it's school construction, small business tax relief, transportation and transit growth, taking a look at how to take this #1 innovation economy and get better at commercialization and taking products to market to grow our economy and our incubator programs here in the state. There are so many ways that we can create jobs when our leadership is held accountable to actually advancing those ideas. The closest thing we had to a job creation the idea that came out of the General Assembly in the entire time I've been there is something I actually had to vote against. It was a tax credit, a job creation tax credit that was actually just money that was going to go into the pockets of employers who were already planning to create jobs. It wasn't anything that was going to actually incentivize new job creation. And so I think there needs to be a massive wake-up call about what it takes to create jobs in Maryland. And the pressure will be there to do that if there isn't somehow this sense that, well, we've already taken care of job creation because we're having these new casinos come in. We've got to do a lot more than that, and I'm not sure that the pressure's going to be there to step up and really do what needs to be done unless this is rejected.
Delegate Kaiser, yeah, please.
Get the flip side. In terms of if this is disapproved, the best and worst case scenario, I mean, I think the worst case scenario, I'm not really sure what the best case scenario is, I should say. But I think in terms of the worst case scenario, we come back and we start talking about gambling again where we felt like we finished the issue. Again, I disagree with Delegate Mizeur's assertion that we're checking some job creation box. What I'm hoping is that we do pass this, but if we don't, either way it goes, I look forward to us in the next session and in future sessions working on all of these issues, transportation, school construction, job creation, and everything else. So my answer here is very brief. I think the worst case scenario is that we create a situation where our slots facilities will remain only slot facilities and not be competitive, and it would be a losing model. And so we will have invested something that will then be certain to fail when the table games would have allowed them to be successful, allowed the state to get money, and allowed these additional jobs to come in.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question. I did a little research on this, and this is for both of you as political prognosticators now, not the pro and the con side. I looked at what happened in other states where there was this similar kind of battle, where the interests, gaming had been approved, someone else wanted to come in under an expansion, there was a referendum. Ohio was one of these states. Referendum, the existing gamers win, and the state legislature drops the issue. So my question is, does this come back, if the ballot issue fails, if the expansion's not approved, Delegate Kaiser first, and then we'll turn to the audience. Does this issue come up again next year, or do the politicians say, well, let's let this cool off for a few years?
I suspect that it will come up again, and before Delegate Mizeur says it, I expect even if we pass it, there could be future expansion in the future. So we could be coming back to this related issue every 4 years. I don't think it will be dropped. My hope, again, is that we pass it so in the next few years we can focus on all the issues that Delegate Mizeur and I agree on, and I'm sure Delegate Dumais agrees on as well in terms of all this workforce development, job creation, all of this. That again, I think it comes back no matter what, and will be taking up a lot of our time.
Comes up again? Delegate Mizeur.
It's hard to say because 20 years ago when Maryland voters approved another question 6 on reproductive rights, that really did kind of put the simmer on fights related to annual political fights on reproductive rights issues. I think that there is a sense that when the voters have their say, there is a respect given to it. I think that if we approve it, that's where the ongoing slippery slope goes. There are already legislators who are pre-filing bills to have a 7th or 8th location for casinos in their areas. And so this just will never stop until we are gobbled up with, because the special interests will dig in and get their hold in this state and continue to try to advance and grow our economy as a casino-based economy. And so, that's the choice here. Is that what we want, or do we want to hold out hope for a different future for Maryland?
Well, I've asked more questions than was my right. Let me turn to the audience for questions.
Thank you. My name is Paul Bessel. Professor Besharov and I went to the same school together. not that far apart from each other even. My question, I think, is best directed to Delegate Mizeur. What you've said about the danger of increased crime and other social ills because of casinos is a serious one. But instead of speculating about it, don't we have real facts? The casino, for example, in Arundel Mills has been there for a while, and if I read correctly, it's one of the largest casinos in the country. What's the crime rate in Anne Arundel County now compared to the crime rate in Anne Arundel County before that casino opened?
Actually, they only just opened the doors of the facility within the last couple of months, so we don't have that data yet. But you can't, and I don't know all the data and statistics right off the top of my head, but I do know, and it's legendary anecdotally, right, about the mafia and the crime in Las Vegas and Atlantic City and their engagement in these activities, and that the places where outside of Maryland where it has existed, and that there is data and information available, that is the case. We don't have data yet in Maryland because Perryville's been open a little bit longer, but it's a smaller facility. It's not the same kind of thing as Maryland Live, and there's also potentially a difference in slot machines versus table games because there's a different type. You don't have high roller slot machines for the most part. You know, it's a different kind of gaming when you bring craps tables and roulette and blackjack and poker versus penny slot machines. And so that's the potential for the crime and the poverty associated, particularly the crime, I think, is more associated with the expansion for the Las Vegas style casinos that are being proposed under this question.
I'd just like to ask the same addition to the question on crime, the addiction, data on addiction. You know, people that shouldn't be gambling get addicted to gambling and then lose all their money. Or whatever. Can you hear me? I don't know whether that was loud.
No, I heard the question about addiction to gambling and other addictions that might lead to. Again, there's no data from the state of Maryland. There's certainly data from other states that suggest that there are some increased social ills. I really have two replies to that. One, Maryland has a compulsive gambling fund that's, I think, the largest of its type from our Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, has a grant to do something great with that. They're still waiting for groups who want that grant money to work on these programs, so that's not quite in place yet. But I guess I look to the analogy of alcohol. We have people in our society, some small percent, that don't handle their alcohol well. They drink too much, or they drink and they drive, or they do other things. And we certainly have problems with people with addiction there. I think it's a small percent of our population. We take steps to regulate alcohol. We limit it at a certain age. We stop selling it at the fourth quarter of Redskins games. We try to have bartenders stop serving it at the end of the night at bars. But we don't make our entire alcohol policy based on that. And I think it's a similar situation that many people who gamble, my grandparents used to take the bus from Pikesville out to Atlantic City with their $20 they were given. And actually, my grandfather would pocket that $20 and just walk on the boardwalk the whole time. He really was the winner on that trip. But my grandmother would spend that 20 and maybe another 20. And this was not money that they lived on. This was entertainment money for them. And for so many other people as well who go to casinos or like to gamble, many people handle it very responsibly. $100 my limit, I win, I stop. I lose, I stop. And so I do think most people handle their gambling as they handle their alcohol. They handle it quite responsibly. And so, again, I think we need to take steps to help the people who have the addiction problems. But I don't think we should make our entire policy from the perspective of the small number of people who have the problems.
Stephen Schwartz. To follow up on the security, what we need, if you all agree with this, is that we need the private security that is going to secure the casino, working alongside with the Montgomery County Police Department, and that will cut down on the crime. As far as the alcohol is concerned, there should not be any alcohol served, and I would like to have your reaction to these things.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what your question is, but I would just point out that some of the crime problem is not just one of violent crime. It's white collar kind of mafia, OSA type crime that exists in communities that just having a increased security presence at the door of the casinos doesn't necessarily address.
How about no alcohol in the casino?
I don't agree
He wants
with.
to put the casinos out of business, is what I think.
Well, they certainly, you know, the casinos, the way they're set up are, again, to House Advantage rules. Make it seem like it's always daylight, keep the clocks out of there, pump air in, let people smoke, let's fill you up with drinks and make you extra happy even if you're losing. And, you know, the house always wins, yay! I don't think there'll be a scenario where they're not serving alcohol.
I would agree with that, but I would suggest there won't be smoking inside the casinos.
What about the deal that the casino operators are getting? And first of all, what's the county and state's cut going to be? And second of all, do you think there's any chance? I've gathered that it's the county and state are not getting a very favorable deal here. What's the chance that this thing, if it does get rejected, that at least if they come back and make an offer which is more generous to the state, you know, out of which the state and counties get more of the cut?
Well, one thing that I always like to say when people ask about the deal we supposedly cut with the owners, I think 2 points to make in terms of when we first passed slots and the voters passed it through referendum 4 years ago, we had what I would call the hardest program across the country, that the slots facilities and slot owners were getting the least amount of money than every other state. So, you know, I would argue that by adjusting the percentages as we did was about making it more competitive. It was part of the reason why we couldn't get the alternate locations set up. And it's also true that by transferring the ownership of the slot machines, and that's one of the, you know, finer details of the legislation, but by transferring the ownership, that is a cost on these facilities. So by giving them more of the cut of the take from gambling, it's partly to offset their new ownership of the machines. So, so from my perspective, it was about making it more competitive. You may be right that if it doesn't pass, since I'm sure this will keep coming up year after year, that maybe it would be, from your perspective and others, a better deal for the county and state. But I do think we had the best deal among all the states, and we did adjust it down.
Diana Haskell, I just have a point of clarification. If this should pass, would it have to pass in Prince George's County in order to have the facility at National Harbor?
So the way there is intent language, there's a lot of confusion about this. There's intent language in the legislation passed by the General Assembly that says that the Prince George's County voters must approve it for the 6th location to be located there. However, it is unclear if that would stand up to a legal challenge if Prince George's County rejects it and there's a decision to move forward with it anyway because it potentially won statewide. That said, given that Prince George's, Montgomery, and Baltimore City are the biggest voting blocks in the state, it's hard to imagine a scenario where it doesn't pass without support. I don't think it can pass statewide without a decent enough support in Prince George's County, so I'm not sure there'll be a scenario where it passes everywhere else but it doesn't in Prince George's. So I'm not sure that that will be put to the test, but it's a little bit unknown.
What she said, I agree.
I've received literature saying that taxpayers, the residents, are going to have some disincentives, that we are going to somehow bail some of these parties out. I wonder if someone can address the accuracy of that. And I guess my second concern is, what does it say about the influence of the gaming industry already that they called a special session, spent limited resources on an issue that is not a life and death issue? And I wonder if maybe Delegate Mizeur can outline who had to approve this, how did we get there, and I do appreciate her comments that this is a poor substitute for good jobs and a steady revenue stream.
And before you hand that mic back, would you maybe just help us? Can you start with that beginning part of your question with some clarification?
I received a mailing saying that if gaming is expanded, the deal that has been struck is ultimately going to cost taxpayers, and I'm not sure how that is accurate or not.
I haven't seen that mailing, but I'm guessing that maybe they're talking about the fact that the casino operators' tax rates were lowered in the provision, and an argument can be made that if gaming were to go forward and the casino rates weren't lowered, you wouldn't have had your taxes increased in the other special session that was dealing with the budget. To answer your question about the mechanics of how a special session gets called, it's under only the governor can call a special session.
And one of our colleagues in the legislature wasn't planning to come because he disagreed with the legislation, but we are state legislators. It is our job to be there during our regular session, which is 3 months a year. And when the governor calls a special session, whether we agree or disagree, it's our job to be there.
Well, this has been a great panel, and we promised both of our representatives, and it's a great honor to have them here, the last word. So I think Delegate Kaiser opened. So Delegate Mizeur, you have a closing statement.
Oh, I didn't know we were going to do that. Well, thanks again for being here. I think the wonderful thing about opportunities like this is to show how we can have a civic engagement and disagree without being disagreeable, which we're not always seeing in politics these days. Delegate Kaiser and I spend a lot more of our time working together on 99% of the issues, particularly the education issue that has come up here today. She does an amazing job chairing the Education Policy Committee, and then I'm on the other side of it as Vice Chair of Education on the Appropriations Committee. So she comes up with all the good policies, and I try to find the money in the Appropriations Committee to fund it. So we're a really good tag team on a range of issues, and so it's wonderful to be here with her today and to have this conversation with you. And I would encourage you to have this ongoing conversation with your friends and your neighbors. There's no right or wrong answer here ultimately. We've had an opportunity to express our viewpoints. I very much hope that you agree that there's a stronger, better, brighter future for Maryland if we reject question 7 and hold our leaders accountable for job creation and economic development that lifts our communities up rather than tear us down. I feel like we've had a very great opportunity today to have a conversation that gives you more information than what the corporate interests outside of Maryland who have pounded the airwaves with $40 million and stuffed your mailboxes with lots of confusing flyers have done. If we were to have more opportunities to have community conversations like this and to have people be engaged on this issue because you've come out, talked with your friends and neighbors, and listened to legislators express their viewpoints, I think our whole democracy would be very much improved. So thank you again for being here today, and I hope that what we've said has been helpful to you, and on a personal level, I hope that you will check the box against question 7, for question 6, for question 4. On November 6th. Thank you very much.
Delegate Kaiser.
Well, thank you. And again, I want to echo everything that Delegate Mizeur said, and thanking all of you for being here today. It really is true, just the opportunity for civic engagement and learning, and that all of you can share with everyone else you know who keeps asking the question, as I constantly get, oh my God, what do I do about question 7? Which, as I hope I've explained today why I think you should support it. I do think, again, that this is, stripped down to just the simple question of should we expand gambling or not? Should our gambling market here in Maryland be competitive? I do think it will bring new jobs. It probably will bring less money than some have suggested it will bring, but I do think it will bring additional dollars that will help us fund not just education, but our other priorities that I'm sure many of us share. And again, I just want to thank you, Doug, and want to thank the League of Women Voters. Please, everyone, grab their voter's guide, grab maybe a few extra copies. I hope there's extra copies out there, and share those with your friends, because I do think it's of great help to understand what this and all the other issues are about. And of course, not just the candidates. You may not realize we have 3 school board races as well in Montgomery County. So, take a look at that as well. And again, I appreciate you giving us this opportunity to be here. Again, I don't think we've been on the opposite sides of any big issues ever before. It was quite a joy to debate my friend Heather today. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us.
And I want to thank both of you. Thank you. And it's now time for our second panel. We'll take a second while we reorganize ourselves here.